In this mini tutorial, we're going to do a detailed overview of the sympathetic nervous system. And the first thing I want to do is just remind you about the very basic organisation of the sympathetic nervous system. You'll recall that the cell bodies of sympathetic preganglionic neurons are found in the spinal cord, and particularly in the lateral horns between levels T1 and around L2. These sympathetic preganglionics extend a relatively short axon to contact a sympathetic postganglionic neuron whose cell body is in one of the sympathetic ganglia which form the sympathetic chain. So this is a sympathetic ganglion, and it's one of many which are to be found in the sympathetic chain. We'll see a little later on that some of the ganglia in the sympathetic system are not in the sympathetic chain. They're actually sitting along the aorta, but for the time being we can think of the ganglia as being in the sympathetic chain. So the postganglionic neuron then has a relatively long unmyelinated axon in contrast to the preganglionic neuron to contact its target. Now, something which is going to become important later on in our mini tutorial is the fact that the sympathetic preganglionics can actually move along the sympathetic chain. So I've drawn one sympathetic ganglion there. If I draw another sympathetic ganglion which sits higher up in the chain and another sympathetic ganglion which sits lower down in the chain, this preganglionic neuron can send its axon up or down the chain, and that becomes important when we're considering the details. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to look at the sympathetic system in a sort of more anatomical sense, and we're going to do that by drawing our cross-section of the spinal cord. So here is a transverse section through the spinal cord, and this would be through the spinal cord at levels T1 through L2, where the sympathetic preganglionics can be found. Here is the central canal. Here's the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, the ventral horn, the lateral horn, the dorsal horn. And you should recall that it is in the lateral horns where the cell bodies of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons reside. Let's add on some roots. So at this point I'm going to add on the ventral root, and at this point I'm going to add on the dorsal root. So here's the dorsal root with its dorsal root ganglion. Here's the ventral root joining with the dorsal root, and then the ventral and dorsal roots come together to form the spinal nerve. I've left those two gaps there for a reason. Now we need to draw on an additional structure connected to the spinal nerve, and that is the sympathetic ganglion. So the sympathetic ganglion is connected to the spinal nerve via two very thin, in fact they're virtually invisible to the naked eye, two very thin connections joining it to the spinal nerve. So this here is one of the sympathetic ganglia in the sympathetic chain, and the sympathetic ganglia are connected to the spinal nerves via processes called rami communicantes. The single being ramus communicans. So the sympathetic ganglia are connected to the spinal nerves via rami communicantes, and the two rami are slightly different. This ramus here is known as the white ramus communicans, and this ramus here is known as the grey ramus communicans. And they get their different names from the fact that there are different types of axons passing through them. And we're going to illustrate this now just by showing you a simple example of a sympathetic circuit. And this might be a circuit which provides sympathetic supply to a particular area of skin supplied by a given spinal nerve. So let's see how that works. Here we've drawn our cell body of our sympathetic preganglionic neuron, and it sends its axon through the ventral root and into the spinal nerve. Now, this sympathetic preganglionic axon does not pass immediately into the spinal nerve because it's got to synapse, hasn't it? We said that in the autonomic nervous system there's not just a single motor neuron, there's a chain of two. And that synapse in this context occurs in the sympathetic ganglion, and this sympathetic preganglionic sends its axon through the white ramus communicans. And this explains why it's called the white ramus, because as you should recall from a previous mini tutorial, the sympathetic preganglionics are myelinated. And because they're myelinated, the fat in the myelin sheath gives the white ramus its white colour. So, to summarise, the cell body of the sympathetic preganglionic is in the lateral horn. It sends its axon through the ventral root into the spinal nerve, and it then enters the sympathetic ganglion through the white ramus communicans. You should note that the white ramus is sitting distal compared to the grey ramus. So this circuit's going to do a kind of loop-the-loop. The next thing we need to draw on is, of course, the postganglionic neuron. So here is the sympathetic postganglionic cell body. The sympathetic postganglionic neuron has an unmyelinated axon which passes through the grey ramus communicans. And the grey ramus is the grey ramus because there's no myelin in there, so it has a greyer colour compared to the white ramus. And you can see that the circuit has done a kind of loop-the-loop, and what we have now is a sympathetic postganglionic neuron in the spinal nerve, which can then be distributed to its ultimate target. And in this specific example, we would be talking about the way in which the skin or skeletal muscle gets its sympathetic innervation in a dermatomal or myotomal pattern. Now, the next part of this mini tutorial is going to be looking at some of the specifics of the sympathetic system, and we're going to look at an axial view and considering the full sympathetic chain, its relationship to the spinal cord, and how other sorts of tissues are innervated. So what we're going to do in this part is we're going to draw a big synoptic diagram. And the first thing that we're going to draw is the central nervous system from the brainstem down to the tip of the cord. So here is the brainstem going down to the bottom of the spinal cord. And alongside that, we're going to draw the sympathetic chain. And we've got to be clear about the levels which we're thinking about here, and whether we're talking about spinal cord levels or vertebral levels. Throughout this mini tutorial, we're always going to be talking about spinal cord levels. So let's just remind you of a few important facts related to spinal cord levels. Of course, the spinal cord begins at this point here, so the C1 segment of the spinal cord is at about the level of the foramen magnum at the base of the skull. And the sympathetic chain starts at the base of the skull. Okay, so the top of the sympathetic chain is near the base of the skull, near the C1 spinal cord and vertebral levels. You should know that down here, the tip of the cord ends at around about the L1, L2 vertebral level. So the tip of the spinal cord ends at the top of the lumbar spine, all right? However, the sympathetic chain ends right down at the tip of the coccyx. So the sympathetic chain runs from the base of the skull down to the tip of the coccyx. The spinal cord runs from the foramen magnum down to about L2 vertebral level. But from now on, we are just going to be talking about spinal cord segments. We're not going to be talking about vertebral levels. Another thing I want to emphasize to you is that we're only going to be considering the sympathetic innervation of two types of structure in this diagram. And that is, we're going to be thinking about the cutaneous innervation of different regions. So we're going to be thinking about how the skin is supplied by sympathetics. And we're going to be thinking about the supply to the gut. We are not going to be thinking about the sympathetic innervation to the heart or the pelvic viscera. We're just restricted to the skin and the gut. The principles are the same for the heart and the pelvic viscera. I'm restricting it to these two areas just for clarity. So now that we've got that clear in our minds, I think that we can now proceed to put on some details. So the first thing that we've got to do is define the levels at which the sympathetic preganglionics can be found. And you should recall that sympathetic preganglionics can be found between the T1 and the L2 spinal cord levels. So the sympathetic preganglionic cell bodies can only be found between the T1 and the L2 spinal cord levels. And we're going to consider 4 sets of sympathetic preganglionics. The first set of sympathetic preganglionics that we're going to consider are those preganglionics which enter the sympathetic chain and synapse at that level. And we've already done those earlier on in this mini tutorial. So these would be the sympathetics which would be supplying a given dermatome. So they synapse at that level within the sympathetic chain. And they might supply skin. Okay. The second set of sympathetics that we want to consider are those which sit around the T1 cord level. They enter the sympathetic chain and then they ascend. They go up through the sympathetic chain and then they synapse. Now, these are the sympathetics which are involved in supplying the head. And specifically, we're thinking the face, okay? So specifically, we're thinking about the face in this case. And the way that they get up to supply the face is that they hitchhike along blood vessels, okay? So in order for us to get a sympathetic innervation to the face, what happens is that the sympathetic preganglionics from around the T1 level ascend through the sympathetic chain, synapse right at the top, and then they send branches directly out of the sympathetic chain onto blood vessels, and they then distribute along the blood vessels. So it's the postganglionics which distribute along blood vessels. The next group which we're going to consider are the sympathetic preganglionics which supply the gut. These do not synapse within the sympathetic chain. They actually pass straight through the sympathetic chain and synapse in ganglia outside of the sympathetic chain, sitting along the aorta. These are the pre-aortic ganglia, which we've talked about before. So here is a postganglionic neuron, which supplies the gut, and the postganglionic neurons which supply the gut can be found within our pre-aortic ganglia. So the supply to the gut is not through a synapse in the sympathetic chain, but through a synapse in one of these additional ganglia. And the structure which emerges from the sympathetic chain at this point here has a special name. They are known as the splanchnic nerves. The splanchnic nerves. So the splanchnic nerves are those which emerge directly from the sympathetic chain. They contain sympathetic preganglionics, and they're destined for these pre-aortic ganglia, where they will synapse on postganglionic neurons to supply the gut itself. Now, the final group that we need to think about are those sympathetics which supply the lower limbs, and they're found in the lower reaches of the sympathetic cell column, i.e. around about the L2 level. And what they do, they enter the sympathetic chain, but then they descend all the way down. And having descended, they are then able to synapse with postganglionic neurons, which then distribute to the lower limbs. Okay, so just to recap, we've described the way that the face, and the eye for that matter, for example, gets its sympathetic innervation. We've described the way that a typical dermatome gets its sympathetic innervation. We've described the way that the gut gets its sympathetics, and we've also described how the lowermost parts of the body get a sympathetic innervation themselves. So what we're going to do next is we're going to draw some cross-sections through these different levels and just demonstrate to you exactly what is going on. And the importance of doing this is to illustrate to you that there are differences at the different levels with respect to how the spinal cord is connected to the sympathetic chain. So the first cross-section we're going to make is through this point here. And this is a section at about the level of, say, T5. So what we need to do is we need to draw our spinal cord, and to save space I'm just going to draw one half of the spinal cord. So here's one half of our spinal cord, central canal with a dorsal horn, a lateral horn and a ventral horn. And remember, we have a lateral horn at this level because we're in the thoracic cord, and the thoracic cord is where the sympathetic preganglionics reside. We have a dorsal root here with a dorsal root ganglion, a ventral root connecting to it, throwing off a spinal nerve with our rami communicantes here. Okay. So let's draw on the sympathetic preganglionic neuron in red, and it resides in the lateral horn there. Let's draw on the sympathetic ganglion connected by the grey ramus communicans and the white ramus communicans. here. And now let's draw on the axon of our sympathetic preganglionic. So it's going to pass into the ventral root and into the white ramus. Okay? And in this case, where we're considering the dermatomal supply at the T5 chord level, so the sympathetic supply for the T5 dermatome, what happens is what we've already described earlier on in the first part of the tutorial, and that is we get a synapse at that level in the sympathetic chain on a postganglionic neuron in green, and it sends its axon up through the grey ramus, which then is distributed through the T5 spinal nerve. So this is the T5 spinal nerve. So now let's have a think about a cross-section at approximately this level here. And I'm going to say that this cross-section was taken at around about the C2 spinal cord level. So once again, let's draw on a cross-section of the spinal cord. There, just the 1/2 as we did before with the central canal. Now this is the cervical spinal cord, so remember that there is no lateral horn. There is no lateral horn in the cervical spinal cord. The lateral horn is only found at thoracic levels. However, there is a dorsal root with a dorsal root ganglion. There is a ventral root coming together to form a spinal nerve. Now, it's important for us to think about, are there any rami communicans at this level? There is definitely a sympathetic ganglion. However, there is no white ramus communicans. There is only a grey ramus communicans. So let's just draw that on and then we'll explain why that's the case. So there's our grey ramus communicans, and there is our sympathetic ganglion. There is no white ramus communicans. Why is there no white ramus? Well, there is no white ramus because at the C2 chord level, we don't have any sympathetic preganglionics. And without sympathetic preganglionics, we don't need any connection to the sympathetic chain. However, there is a grey ramus because preganglionics will have ascended through the chain, as we drew on the left, and might then need to enter the spinal nerves. So what we can show is a sympathetic preganglionic which is ascending from lower levels through the sympathetic chain and now entering this sympathetic ganglion which sits at about the C2 spinal cord level. So this is a sympathetic preganglionic which has ascended the chain and has now gotten into the uppermost parts of the sympathetic chain itself. Now, a few things can happen here. What we've drawn on the left is we showed how we get a synapse in the uppermost part of the sympathetic chain on a postganglionic neuron, and then that sends a branch directly out of the sympathetic ganglion, which runs along a blood vessel to get to the skin of the face. So that would be how we get to the face. Through a direct branch which leaves the uppermost sympathetic ganglia, runs along blood vessels, so those would be branches of the common carotid artery, and then enters the face. So that's how the face gets its sympathetic supply. But of course, alternatively, what could happen, and remember this is at the C2 chord level, we could have a synapse upon another sympathetic postganglionic, which then sends its axon through the grey ramus and into the C2 spinal nerve. So this is the C2 spinal nerve. And that green axon, that postganglionic which has entered the C2 spinal nerve, would be the sympathetic supply for the C2 dermatome, which you should recall is the back of the head. Okay? So up at this topmost region of the sympathetic chain, we've got the vascular branches going onto the carotid system supplying the face, the skin of the face, but we've also got some dermatomal branches entering the spinal nerve to supply the uppermost dermatomes. The next level which I want to consider is here, and this is, we'll think of this as around about the T9 spinal cord level, and at around about this level we have sympathetic preganglionics which supply the gut. So let's consider how the gut is supplied. And once again we're going to draw on a half section of the spinal cord. And this being at T9, we do have a lateral horn, thoracic cord, remember. We have a dorsal root with a dorsal root ganglion, a ventral root coming together. We have a spinal nerve, and it being at T9, we have got a grey ramus and a white ramus there, and a T9 spinal nerve. Of course, we've also got a sympathetic ganglion. So now we'll draw on our sympathetic preganglionic at around about this T9 level, and that would be in the lateral horn. It would enter the ventral root, it would go into the white ramus, but it would not synapse within the sympathetic chain. It would leave the sympathetic chain and synapse in a ganglion outside of the sympathetic chain, sitting just in front of the aorta, and that is one of the pre-aortic ganglia, just there. Okay, so this is the way that the gut is supplied, and as we said earlier, this here is a splanchnic nerve, and the splanchnic nerves contain sympathetic preganglionics destined for these pre-aortic ganglia which supply the gut. So that's how the gut is supplied. The final level which I want to consider is the level down here, and as you should be able to appreciate, I can't assign this a spinal cord level because we're down at the bottom of the sympathetic chain, and the spinal cord has run out, so there is no cord down at the bottom of the vertebral column. But what we can still draw on, we can draw on the dorsal root coming down rather from the cord, and it's still got a dorsal root ganglion, and it still does form a spinal nerve. There's also a ventral root which has descended from the spinal cord higher above. And down at this level there is no white ramus because we are way below the level at which the sympathetic preganglionics are found, but there is a grey ramus. So there is a grey ramus, but there is no white ramus coming down off of the spinal nerve because the sympathetic preganglionics have all run out at this low level. So the way in which the lower limbs, say for example the S2 dermatome, get their sympathetic innervation is that preganglionics descend through the chain from higher levels and they synapse on postganglionics in these low sympathetic ganglia, which then send their axons into the grey ramus and into the spinal nerve. So this might be entering the S2 spinal nerve, for example. So that would be how the dermatomes of the lower limbs get their sympathetic innervation, via preganglionics which have descended through the chain. So I hope that this has been useful. You're going to need to watch this a few times, and I do recommend that you do some additional reading on this to really consolidate it. A good source which provides a good overview of the autonomic nervous system is Instant Anatomy by Robert Whittaker, and that's got some really nice, clear, simple diagrams and some simple rules to follow, which should hopefully help you to understand this further. Okay, thank you.